cold came through the soles of her boots first. Not the clean cold of a Canadian winter, the kind you respected and dressed for, but the wet cold of borderland swamp, the kind that soaked through leather and found your bones and stayed there. Nyla had been walking for 3 hours. She could not feel her toes anymore. She had stopped checking on that sometime around the 2nd hour, and she'd decided that feeling her toes was a luxury, and moving forward was not. A bundle against her chest shifted. Small hands, barely the size of her palm, curled against her collarbone. She pressed her own hand over them and felt the faint heat there, too faint, the heat of a body working too hard to stay warm instead of working to grow. His name was Finn. He was 8 weeks old. He was not hers. But she had taken him from the eastern wing of the Greywood Pack's main house 4 hours ago, through the servants' corridor that she had scrubbed on her hands and knees every Thursday for the past 5 years. She had carried him wrapped in her own scarf, the one her mother had knitted the winter before the wasting sickness took her, and she had walked out the back door while the Pack's attention was turned toward the bonfire celebration in the western yard. No one had watched the servants exit. No one ever did. The Greywood forest thinned at its northern edge, where the land went boggy and unreliable. Pack wolves avoided it because paws sank and the footing was treacherous. But Nyla had legs, not paws, and she had spent 2 years memorizing the raised ridgelines where the ground stayed solid. She'd done it the way she did most useful things, quietly, without telling anyone, and the theory that information kept private was information kept safe. The border between Greywood territory and Thornwall Pack land was not marked on any official map. Officially, the 2 packs did not share a border. They had not spoken in 11 years, since the incident that no one named directly but everyone referenced in lowered voices, the same way people talk around a dead in the house. The border existed anyway, the way all real things existed, whether or not they were acknowledged. A line of standing stones older than either pack, moss-covered and leaning, running north to south through the bogland. She was almost there. She could see the nearest stone's silhouette against the grey, pre-dawn sky. Finn made a sound, not a cry, something smaller and more frightening than a cry, a thin thread of sound like a radio signal fading in and out. "I hear you," Nyla said. Her voice came out raw, but she had not spoken aloud in hours and her throat had tightened in the cold. "I hear you, almost there." She did not know if almost there meant anything. She did not know what was on the other side of those stones. Thornwall's reputation was built on 2 things. Its warriors, who were said to be the finest fighters in 4 territories, and its alpha, who was said to be something other than entirely human, in the way that all truly powerful wolves were, but more so. Dre Thornwall, 34 years old, alpha for 9 years, no mate, no chosen partner, nothing. Stories about him ranged from the practical. He ran a tight pack with low crime and high loyalty, to the mythological. He had once stood down a rogue wolf 3 times his weight, with nothing but eye contact. He was about to walk into his territory carrying a stolen infant. She was not thinking about consequences. Consequences were what happened when you had options, and she had run out of those on Tuesday, and she'd gone to change Finn's bedding, and found the note. It had been written on Greywood letterhead, in the Beta's handwriting she recognized from years of watching him sign requisition forms for supplies she then went and fetched. Sickly pup. Do not resource. The heir position will be re-evaluated. The heir position. As if Finn were a vacancy to be posted rather than a person. As if 8 weeks of life were an audition that he was currently failing by having the wrong kind of ear infection. Finn was Aldrich Greywood's son, his only son. His dead mate had given birth on a cold night in October, while the pack physician was 3 kilometers away attending to the Beta's family, and she had hemorrhaged before anyone reached her. The alpha had not emerged from his quarters in the 6 weeks since. He was in there, but he was not present, not the way an alpha needs to be present. And the beta had moved into that absence like water filling a crack in stone, which slowly, thoroughly, in a way that looked almost natural until you looked at what had been displaced. Nyla had watched it happen from the corners of rooms, the way she watched most things. She had no wolf. She had been born to a Greywood mother and a father she had never met, and, at 14, when her cohort had shifted for the first time in the ceremony field behind the community hall, she had stood in the grass and felt nothing. Not even fear, just a peculiar emptiness, like a room with all the furniture removed. They had not exiled her. She was useful. She knew how to cook, how to clean clinic equipment, how to read dosages and track supply inventories. The pack kept her the way you keep a good appliance. Maintained, not cherished, replaced when broken. She had worked for the pack healer for 5 years, which meant she had access to the medical wing, which meant she had been the one checking on Finn when the assigned nursery staff stopped coming as often as they should have. She crossed the border stones at 4:17 in the morning. The ground on the Thornwall side was firmer, the trees older, taller, the undergrowth pressed back as if the forest itself kept a respectful distance from the territory boundary. She had taken 6 steps past the stones when the wolves appeared. There were 3 of them, in patrol formation, 2 flanking one in the center. They had not made a sound. They were simply there, the way a wall is simply there, present and immovable. The center wolf was large, dark-coated, watching her with pale eyes that caught the faint pre-dawn light. Nyla stopped. She put both hands around Finn, pressing him closer, and she said the only thing she had. "He needs a healer, but please." The dark wolf shifted. The change was smooth, faster than anything she had seen in Greywood, and then a man was standing where the wolf had been. He was built like someone who worked outdoors in all seasons, broad through the shoulders, unhurried in his movements. He had a beard, close-cropped, and dark eyes that were doing the same rapid assessment that all experienced wolves did when they encountered an unknown quantity. Cataloguing, categorizing, measuring threat. "Came through the bogland," he said. "Yes, from Greywood, yes." He stepped closer. His eyes dropped to the bundle at her chest, and something shifted in his face, subtle but real. "How old?" 8 weeks. "He has an ear infection. He hasn't been eating consistently. He's lost weight in the last 10 days. She said it the way she'd rehearsed it in her head during the walk, in the clipped language of medical summary, because medical summary was the language that made people act instead of deliberate. "His name is Finn. He's Aldrich Greywood's son." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the one before. "The heir," Wolf said. "Yes." He looked at her for a long moment. "And you are? No one important." "I was the healer's assistant. I'm the one who checked on him. You crossed bogland in the dark, carrying a sick infant." He tilted his head slightly. "And you're no one important. I know where the firm ground is. That's all." She paused. "Please, a pack healer." "I know Thornwall has one. I'll go back. I'll submit to whatever process you need. I just need him seen to first." The wolf, whose name she did not yet know was Cassidy, 2nd lieutenant to the Thornwall Alpha, looked at her for 3 more seconds. And he said, "Get inside," and gestured toward the patrol outpost at the tree line that she hadn't even noticed until he moved toward it. The warmth hit her when the door opened. Her body registered it as a physical shock, heat after hours of cold, and her legs went unreliable beneath her. She caught the doorframe and stayed on her feet through sheer stubbornness, which was the resource she had in most abundance. Someone brought her water, but someone else radioed ahead. But she sat in a wooden chair near a wood stove and held Finn against her chest and listened to his breathing, counting the intervals in the mental arithmetic of temperature and hydration that she'd learned to do over 5 years of watching the pack healer work. "The Alpha's been notified," Cassidy said, from across the room, watching her with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. "He doesn't need to come himself. Just the healer. He's already coming." He heard the radio call. He paused. "He monitors all border contacts personally." The door opened before she had time to process what that meant. She felt it before she saw him. That was the only way she could describe it afterward, a change in the air pressure of the room, a subtle densening of everything, as if gravity had quietly increased by a degree. The fire in the wood stove did not dim, but the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to deepen slightly, the way shadows do when a larger light source enters from outside and the smaller light recalibrates. Dre Thornwall was not what the stories had prepared her for. The stories described a warlord, all controlled violence and cold command. And there was that in him, visible in the set of his shoulders, in the way he moved through a space with the unconscious authority of someone who had never once wondered whether he had the right to be somewhere. He was tall, but lean in the way of people who stayed lean through constant movement rather than deprivation, with dark hair worn short and a face that looked like it had been designed for utility rather than appeal, and had achieved both anyway. He stopped in the center of the room. He looked at her. She had braced herself to be looked at the way she was usually looked at, the quick, dismissive survey that clocked her as a greywood wolf, female, small, probably not armed. Proceed accordingly. That was not what happened. He went still. Not tense, not alert, but still in the specific way that very large and dangerous animals go still when they encounter something they did not expect. His nostrils flared once, but then something moved through his expression that she had no framework to interpret, something that crossed his face like a weather front, rapid and transformative. He said something low and involuntary in a language she did not speak, a single word, rough at the edges, in the old tongue that Pax used for ceremonies and binding oaths. She caught the shape of it, but not the meaning. "What?" she said. His jaw tightened, crossed the room in measured steps, controlled, deliberate, and crouched in front of her chair so that he was eye-level with her instead of looming. But she had never had someone powerful choose to make themselves smaller in her presence. She didn't know what to do with it. "The infant," he said. "Let me see him." She pulled back the scarf. Finn's face was flushed, his eyes half shut, his small chest working harder than it should. Dre looked at the pup for a long moment, then stood and turned. "Renna." His voice carried without effort. A door opened somewhere above them, and footsteps descended. The healer was older than Nyla had imagined, somewhere in her late 50s, with silver-streaked hair, braided back, and the permanently unhurried manner of someone who had learned that panic was a waste of diagnostic time. She took Finn from Nyla's arms with the brisk confidence of someone who had done this thousands of times, and Nyla let him go. It was harder than the bogland crossing had been. "You," Renna said, already examining the infant, not looking up. "What did you observe?" Nyla told her. Temperature, feeding frequency, the sound of his breathing, the color of his skin over the past 3 days, the specific timeline of decline. Renna listened without interrupting, made 3 sounds of quiet assessment and said, "Ear infection, untreated, secondary dehydration, weight deficit, serious but manageable. Will need IV fluids and a course of antibiotics." She looked up then, finally, and studied Nyla's face. "You're the one who kept the records. I kept notes, informal ones, good notes." Renna said it like a verdict. She turned and carried Finn toward the interior of the outpost, already issuing quiet instructions to the patrol wolves, who moved to follow her. Ella watched him go and felt the particular exhaustion that comes when the thing you have been holding together through sheer will is finally, temporarily, in someone else's hands. Dre was still in the room. She had not heard him move, but when she turned, he was closer than she'd expected, not crowding her, but present in that way he seemed to be, presences that didn't require proximity to be felt. "They know he's gone," he said. Yes, by now. She had calculated the timing during the walk. Beta will have discovered it by 6. It's almost 5, and your plan was to simply hand him over and return. My plan was to get him to a healer. What happens after is your jurisdiction. Dre looked at her the way you look at something that does not fit the category you initially assigned it to. "You have a broken finger," he said, "on your left hand." She looked down. The small finger had been crooked since the crossing, when she'd caught herself on one of the border stones in the dark. She had been aware of it the way you are aware of a toothache when you're in the middle of an emergency, noted, filed, not yet addressed. "It's not important." "It is going to be addressed," he said. Not aggressively, simply as a fact of the immediate future, like weather. After Finn. He is being seen to. He paused. "Rena will not let you back in that room until she has finished, and she takes as long as she takes. So you will sit down, you will eat something, and Rena will look at your hand before you leave." I said I'd return to Greywood. "You said that to get through my border," he said. The amber in his eyes was steady. "I heard it in your voice. You said what you needed to say." She had no answer for that, because he was right. She ate. Food was plain, bread and something warm and savory in a mug, and it landed in her empty stomach like a stone, not unpleasantly. One of the younger patrol wolves refilled the mug without being asked, and she wrapped both hands around it because the warmth was immediately necessary. Dre sat across from her, not hovering, not observing with the pointed attention of someone waiting for her to slip up. He was simply there, looking at the wood stove. Occasionally looking at her, there was no performance in it. "What's your name?" he said. "Nyla." "No rank?" "No wolf either, if that's your next question." "It wasn't." He tilted his head slightly. "How long were you in Greywood?" "My whole life. My mother was born there." She paused. "My father wasn't. He passed through. He didn't stay. Did he leave anything?" She thought of the photograph her mother had kept folded in a book. A man she did not recognize, with a mark on his left shoulder, crescent-shaped, like a brand or a birthmark. Her mother had not explained it. Her mother had not explained much. "A photograph," Nyla said, "and apparently me." Rena came back 40 minutes later. Her expression was brisk but not alarmed, which Nyla had already learned to read as the healer's version of cautious optimism. "The pup is stabilizing. Will need to stay under observation for the next 24 hours. She set her bag on the table and looked at Nyla. "Now you hand." Nyla put her hand on the table. Rena examined the small finger with efficient, ungentle fingers. Clean break. Needs to be set and splinted. She looked up over her glasses. "This will hurt." "I know, it did." Nyla did not make a sound. Not because she was performing toughness, but because she had learned a long time ago in Greywood that making sounds when things hurt drew attention, and attention was unpredictable. She had learned to swallow pain as a practical measure. When it was done, and her finger was splinted, and her hand was wrapped, she looked up and found Dre watching her. His face was composed, his eyes were not. "Who?" said quietly. "It doesn't matter, Nyla, a stone, in the dark. I caught myself on it during the crossing." She met his eyes. "Nothing that was done to me. I want to be clear about that." He held her gaze for a moment. "All right," he said, and she heard in those two words that he was filing the subject away rather than accepting her answer, but that he was not going to push it in this room, in this moment. The radio crackled. A Greywood frequency. Cassidy had it isolated for monitoring. Greywood was reporting a stolen infant and a missing Omega, using the word dangerous with the particular energy of people who need a word to mean something other than what it means. Dre listened to the transmission without expression. "Dangerous," he said when it had finished. "The beta needs a story," Nyla said. "I'm a more convenient character than we were letting the heir starve. He's claiming you're delusional, but you became attached to the infant and took him in a break from reason. I know. The Alpha is presumably endorsing this account." She looked at the wood stove. "Aldrich has been in his room for 6 weeks, is endorsing whatever he's told to endorse." Dre was quiet for a moment. She had the sense of him making decisions in real time, running through variables with the speed of someone who had been doing it for years. "Thornwall will not be returning the pup," he said. She looked at him. "Or you," he added. "You can't just. The infant is Greywood's heir, found in a state of medical neglect within Greywood territory. That is documented now. My healer is thorough." His voice was even, almost conversational, the tone of a man who had made peace with his own authority. If Aldrich wants to discuss his son, he can come in person. The beta does not speak for the heir's welfare. It has been made quite clear this morning. She stared at him. Why? She said. Because a child was being starved, he said. And the woman who crossed my border in the dark to save him is not going back to be called dangerous by the people who created the conditions she was running from. You don't know me? No. Huh? He looked at her steadily. I intend to change that. She had no framework for what he meant. She catalogued the words, set them aside, returned to the only solid ground she could find. Finn first. Finn is being cared for. He stood and moved toward the door. Come, we're going to the main house. There are rooms, and food that isn't mug broth, and Renna will want to check on both of you through the morning. But she followed him, because she had run out of reasons not to, and because somewhere under the exhaustion and the cold and the chronic alertness she had maintained for 3 hours in a bog, some very quiet part of her had stopped bracing for the catch. She had not stopped bracing in years. It was strange to notice it happening. The Thornwall main house was built from dark stone and old timber, set into a hillside so that it looked as if it had grown there rather than been constructed. It smelled like wood smoke and dried herbs and faintly of bread, and the floors were flagstone under woven rugs in deep green and brown colours that reminded her of the forest she had just walked out of. The guards who opened the doors before Dre reached them did not speak. They did not need to. She watched the way the pack moved around him and thought of water moving around stone, not because they were afraid, but because his presence set the direction. Renna was already there. Nyla did not know how she had gotten ahead of them, but she was there, and she had Finn in a proper bassinet, in a warm room on the 2nd floor, and the infant was connected to a small IV line and was sleeping with the concentrated ferocity of someone doing the serious work of recovering. Nyla stood in the doorway and felt something crack in her chest, not painfully. The way ice cracks in spring, the sound of something that has held too long under too much weight, finally beginning to give. She did not cry. She put her back against the doorframe and pressed her splinted hand flat against the stone, and she breathed until the pressure in her throat went back down. Dre did not comment on it. He was simply there, a few feet away, looking at the infant in the bassinet with an expression she was starting to recognize as his default when faced with something that required a response other than command. Careful. Assessing. His father should see him, Nyla said. Have sent a message to Aldrich directly. Not through the beta. His voice was even. Whatever grief he's carrying, he has a son who needs him to carry it upright. She nodded. The days that followed had a texture she didn't have a word for. Not peace exactly, because peace implied the absence of difficulty, and there was plenty of difficulty. Greywood formally demanded Finn's return through official channels, but they formally declined through official channels with attached documentation from Renna that read, in the restrained language of medical reporting, like a prosecution brief. She ate, but she slept in a room that had a door with a latch that worked, which sounds like a small thing and was not. She helped Renna with Finn's care, because the healer asked her to, and because Finn screamed at everyone else, with a sustained ferocity that the healer described, approvingly as excellent lung development. She did not see much of Dre in those first few days. He was there, visible, present in the periphery the way he seemed always to be, but he kept his distance in a way that felt deliberate rather than disinterested. She spent time trying to work out the difference and decided eventually that it was the same as the space between wanting to hold something and knowing that reaching for it before it was ready would cause it to flinch back. She had done a great deal of flinching in her life, was aware that she did it, and she found it quietly extraordinary that someone who could have simply proceeded had noticed and stepped back instead. On the 4th day, the Greywood delegation arrived. She watched them from the upstairs hall through a carved screen that overlooked the receiving room below. 3 wolves, the beta, whose name was Oren, narrow-faced and contained, the kind of contained that required constant active maintenance. His mate Sarah, who was wearing the former Luna's grey travel cloak, and who did not appear to know that Nyla was the one who had laundered that cloak and could identify it at 20 paces. And the pack's senior elder, a man named Bolt, who was so old he seemed to be mostly framework, but who moved with an intention that suggested age had compressed rather than diminished him, which Dre received them in the carved chair at the end of the room that was not technically a throne, but which performed the same function through architectural implication. He sat in it, the way people sit in chairs they have occupied for long enough that the furniture has forgotten there was a time before them. Oren spoke first. He was good at it. Nyla had watched him in council meetings, had noted the way he modulated his voice, controlled his pacing, presented information in the order most likely to produce the response he wanted. He was doing all of that now. He said that Nyla was unstable. He said she had developed an unhealthy fixation on the heir. He said that her lack of a wolf had always been a source of personal bitterness, and that this had finally manifested in an act of delusional abduction. He said all of this in the voice of someone who was trying to be kind about a difficult situation. Dre said nothing. He let the silence stretch after Oren had finished. 5 seconds. 10. The beta's left hand began to move against his thigh, a small rhythmic press that was the only visible sign that the silence was doing what silence is designed to do. My healer's report documents 3 weeks of escalating medical neglect, Dre said finally. The infant presented with untreated infection, secondary dehydration, and weight loss inconsistent with appropriate feeding schedules. I have that report. He paused. I also have the note that was found in the nursery. On greywood letterhead in your handwriting, Beta. The room went the kind of quiet that has physical weight. The woman who brought Finn across the border is not delusional, Dre said. She is my pack's protected guest. If that designation requires clarification, I'm happy to provide it. Oren's smooth surface flickered. With respect, Alpha, a wolfless Omega from Greywood cannot be. She is not, Dre said, and his voice dropped half a register in a way that made the word not fill the room, an Omega, and she is not wolfless. But we can discuss that separately. Nyla's hand tightened on the carved screen. Bolt stepped forward, was looking at the screen, not at Dre at the screen, at her. The old man's eyes were the pale grey of February sky, and they were unerringly accurate about where she was standing. The girl doesn't know what she is, Bolt said. His voice was papery and precise. She couldn't. We made sure of it. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. I will explain, the old man said, to Dre rather than to Oren, who had begun to look like a man standing too close to something that was going to make a loud noise. But not here, with the girl present. Nyla came down the stairs. She did it because she had spent her entire life being discussed in rooms she was not in, and she was finished with that particular experience. She came down the stairs and through the door into the receiving room, and she stood in the space between the elder and the alpha, and she said, "Say it where I can hear it." Bolt looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his face. Not quite guilt, but something older than guilt, something that had been carried so long it had become structural. Your father's name was Cole, he said. He was not a drifter. He was the last surviving son of the Asheville line. The name meant nothing to her. Then it did. She had heard it once in a story one of the older pack members had told during a winter gathering, the way you tell stories about things that are gone and safe to romanticize. With Asheville line, the first wolves, a bloodline the moon herself is said to have shaped. She had taken it in the way you take in all such stories, as atmosphere, as cultural texture, not as something with operational relevance to her actual life. That's not possible, she said. Your father came through Greywood 26 years ago, Boat said, fleeing the council that had ordered his line extinguished. A council of elders had decided that a bloodline with that degree of power was a political liability. He paused. He met your mother. He stayed long enough. Then the council caught up with him and he ran. He didn't know about you. And you did. I knew about the Ashfield mark. When you were born and I saw it on your shoulder. What mark? A voice came out flat. Left shoulder, he said. Crescent shape. You've had it since birth. She put her hand to her shoulder without meaning to. She had always had a mark there, pale, crescent-shaped, the kind of thing you stop noticing after enough years. Her mother had called it a birthmark. She had not had the resources to investigate further. I bound your wolf, Bolt said, when you were 2 years old. Old sigils. Old magic. The kind that hasn't been practiced openly in decades, because most people don't know it, and those who do are cautious with it. His voice was steady, the steadiness of a man who had made a decision he lived with, rather than one he had made peace with. Did it because an Ashvale wolf in Greywood would have brought the council to our doorstep within a season, we would have been destroyed. Hundreds of lives. Against one, she said. He did not look away. Against one. Yes, she stood with that for a moment, the math of it, specific arithmetic of a choice that had shaped the entire landscape of her life. Her failed shifting ceremony, the word hollow, the years of knowing there was a room in her that she had never been able to enter, and finding out now in a stone hall in a rival pack's territory that someone had simply locked the door. Can it be undone? She said. Yes. Dre spoke from across the room. He had been still through all of it, watching with an attention that felt like a hand on her shoulder without being a hand on her shoulder. Renna knows the reversal. It's not a pleasant process. I didn't ask if it was pleasant. The ghost of something crossed his face. She was almost certain it was the first thing that had qualified as a smile since she'd met him. Oren had been very quiet, but she turned to look at him, because she had not forgotten he was there, and she had not forgotten the note. You were letting Finn die, she said. He said nothing. His eyes went to Dre in the way of a person looking for a resource and finding none. Nyla. Dre's voice was measured. Oren and Sierra will be escorted to the border. I will communicate with Greywood through appropriate channels. He looked at the beta. Greywood is currently without effective alpha leadership, which creates a significant governance problem for the Northern Territories. The Council of Packs will be informed. What happens to your position in that context is a matter for that process. Oren opened his mouth. You may leave, Dre said. They left. Bolt lingered at the door. He looked at Nyla, and she let him look, because she had not yet worked out what she wanted to say to him, and she was not going to say the wrong thing by default. I visited your mother, he said. Every month, until she died. I brought what I could. I know, she said. She did not know. She had not known until this moment, but it landed somewhere under the anger as a weight, something that complicated the clean shape of what she felt, and she was not ready to pretend it didn't. The wolf will be angry, he said. When she comes through, she has been in there a long time. Good, Nyla said, and she meant it. She found Dre in the courtyard afterward, standing at the low stone wall that overlooked the northern hillside, the forest dark and dense below, the morning sky doing its slow business above the tree line. She stood beside him, and for a while neither of them said anything, which was something she was finding she could do with him in a way she could not do with most people. Silence with most people felt like an obligation, a space that needed filling. With him it was simply space. You knew, she said, before he said anything, in the outpost. My wolf knew something, he said. I don't make decisions based on things I can't yet explain, but now you can explain it. He was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the trees below and the sound came up to them, steady and patient. The Ashvale bloodline was rumored to be the mate bloodline for the Thornwall line, he said. Not the pack. The bloodline, the specific line. It's old mythology. I didn't know it was anything more than that until 20 minutes ago. She looked at the hillside. That's not why, he said. I want to be clear about that. I would have turned this pack over to keep you here before I knew your father's name. You would have turned your pack over for a wolfless Omega from Greywood. For the woman who crossed a bog in the dark with a broken finger and another man's child because no one else was going to. He looked at her. Yes, she had no practice with being wanted for accurate reasons. Everything in her life had been wanted for its utility, its willingness to be small, its capacity to absorb things without complaint. She stood next to the stone wall, and she felt the familiar instinct to locate the catch, to find the place where this would cost her, and she looked for it and could not find it. "I want to see Finn," she said. "He's awake," Dre said. Renna says he's been staring at the ceiling and making what she describes as extremely opinionated noises. Something moved in her chest. She turned toward the door. "Nyla." She stopped. He was still looking at the hillside. "Tomorrow, if you're willing. The binding removal." He paused. "You should know what you are before you decide what you want." She thought about this. "I already know what I want," she said. "But yes, tomorrow." Renna did it in the main healing room in the morning, with Dre in the chair by the window and Finn in a padded carrier strapped to a young patrol wolf in the hallway, who had, on the previous evening, demonstrated an entirely implausible competency with infants and had been assigned accordingly. 7 sigils, Renna said, laying out her instruments with the calm of someone who had read everything she could find and was choosing not to be frightened by it. Which one will feel like something releasing? The last one will feel like more than that. "I understand. You don't," Renna said, not unkindly. "But you will." She was right on both counts. The first sigil broke and Nyla felt it in her sternum, not in her back where the marks were. A sharp cracking sensation like a green branch under pressure, and behind it something that pressed forward from inside her chest, urgent and indignant and vast. At the 5th sigil she was holding the edges of the cot with both hands, the splintered finger protesting, and making sounds she couldn't fully control. Not screaming, but close, sounds that came from a depth she hadn't known she had. Dre moved to the edge of her peripheral vision. She felt him there without looking at him. The 6th sigil broke and the windows flexed in their frames, a deep vibration moving through the glass and the stone and the floor beneath the cot, and Renna said, "Good, yes, there she is," in the voice of a woman confirming a professional hypothesis. The 7th sigil broke like a door kicked open from the inside. Nyla felt herself come apart and reassemble in the same breath. Not painfully, not anymore, but with a totality that made everything that had come before feel like she had been trying to see through frosted glass. Her spine lengthened, her hands changed. The room, which had been ordinary stone and lamplight, became something else entirely. She could smell the herbs in Renna's kit individually, could hear Finn's breathing 3 walls away, could hear Dre's heartbeat from across the room, faster than his composed expression suggested, running hard. She landed on 4 paws, and the cot was somewhere below her, and the room was suddenly a manageable size rather than a large one. Her fur was the pale grey of birch bark. Her eyes, when she found them in the window glass, were silver, the particular silver of the moon on still water. She was not the largest wolf in the room. She was the only wolf in the room, but she understood with a clarity that bypassed language that she did not need to be the largest. She was not built for size. She was built for something older and more specific, like a key cut for a particular lock. She turned and looked at Dre. He looked back. He had risen from the chair without appearing to move. His hands were at his sides and he was entirely still, and the expression on his face was the one she had been slowly learning to read, the one under the alpha command and the controlled authority, the one that was simply him, unmediated, looking at something that had clarified into exactly what he'd hoped it was. She shifted back. It was natural, unremarkable, like breathing out after breathing in. Was on her knees on the cracked stone floor, and Dre was already crossing the room, and he held out his shirt without asking, the same way someone holds out an umbrella when it's raining, simple and obvious, and not requiring explanation. She took it. It was warm from his body and smelled like wood smoke and cold air and something that was just him, and she pulled it around her shoulders and looked up at him. The floor. she said. He looked at the cracked stone. "Rena will be furious. I'll pay for it. With what?" "Not unkind. Genuinely curious. I'm extremely good at inventory management," she said. She had not heard him laugh before, and the sound was so unexpected and real and ungoverned that she felt it rearrange something in her chest. He laughed and looked at her, and she looked back, and neither of them looked away. Rena made a sound from the corner. "Both of you out of my healing room. The floor is a hazard, and I have work to do." They moved Finn to a proper nursery on the 3rd floor. He arrived in the arms of the patrol wolf who had been minding him, who appeared to have acquired significant infant-related feelings during the interlude, and surrendered the baby with visible reluctance. Neela held Finn against her shoulder and paced the length of the room, an old habit from his early weeks when movement was the only thing that settled him. And he made his small chattering sounds into the side of her neck and grabbed a fistful of her hair with both hands, which she was told was a sign of excellent motor development, and chose to believe. Dre sat in the chair by the window, not hovering. There, looking out at the evening sky with the particular expression of a man who has resolved a long question and is now accustomed to the silence where the question used to be. "Aldrich responded," he said, "to my direct communication." But she paused in her pacing. "He's requesting guardianship be transferred to Thornwall formally. His words were," he paused looking at the window, he said, "I am not the father my son needs. I know who is. He's grieving." But she said yes. He watched her. Not angry at him. He failed Finn. He'll have to live inside that. She shifted Finn to her other shoulder. "Anger would take up space I need for other things." Dre was quiet for a moment. Then, "Greywood is requesting Thornwall take formal oversight of the territory during the leadership transition. The Council of Pax has approved the arrangement, provisionally. You're also acquiring a grieving pack with a vacancy problem." "It appears so." She looked at him. He was watching her with that steady amber attention that she was increasingly certain she was going to spend a significant amount of time being watched with, and she found she did not mind it, which was new. Most attention in her experience had been of the kind you tried to avoid. His was of the kind that made you want to stay in the room. "I'll need authority in that arrangement," she said. "If Thornwall is taking oversight, I need a role. Not nominal, real. What role did you have in mind?" "Something with teeth," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "I was going to suggest Luna," he said mildly, as if this were a scheduling matter. "But teeth is accurate." But she stopped pacing. Finn made a sound of protest at the cessation of movement. "That's," she started over. "You move very fast. I've been waiting 11 years for my wolf to identify a mate," he said. "I'm not inclined to be slow about it now that she has." He paused. "But I'll go at whatever pace you need. What I'm not doing is pretending the bond isn't there, because it's inconvenient to acknowledge." She looked at Finn, at his small fists, at the way he had fallen partially asleep against her shoulder, with the boneless trust of an infant who had recently learned that sleep was safe. "I need to know this pack first," she said. "Reasonable. I need to know I have a function here that isn't dependent on you. Also reasonable. I need to know what Rena thinks of me, because I have the impression that her opinion matters more than most in this house." He looked genuinely startled by that, which was satisfying. "She thinks you take good notes and have appropriate priorities," he said, which from Rena is roughly equivalent to a civic commendation. "Good." She looked at the window. Outside, the moon was rising above the tree line, full and unhurried, the kind of moon that does not feel the need to announce itself. "Then yes. Yes, to which part?" "All of it," she said, but in the right order. She heard him let out a long, quiet breath, the kind of breath you let out at the end of a very long wait. 3 weeks later, they held the ceremony in the main hall, under the skylight that Nyla had discovered on her 5th day in the house, a large pane of old glass set into the vaulted ceiling that she had stood under in the early morning and watched the frost patterns on and thought, someone built this specifically to look at sky. She liked a pack that built things for reasons other than function. Finn was present, as in Renna's arms, which had become his preferred location when Nyla was unavailable, and he was wearing a small knitted hat that Renna denied having made and which bore no identifying labels. He had Aldrich's dark hair and his mother's particular quality of attention, a steadiness in his eyes that seemed too developed for an infant, as if he were reserving judgment on everything until he had more data. Neela wore the deep charcoal grey of Thornwall formal wear, because when Dre had asked what she wanted, she had said, "I don't want to look like a ghost," and he had not laughed, he had simply arranged it. The Ashvale crescent mark on her left shoulder was visible above the neckline. She had decided she was not hiding it. She walked to the front of the hall and took Dre's hand, and she felt the bond between them the way you feel something structural, not something added on but something that had been there all along, waiting for the obstruction to be removed so the current could run. He said the old words, the Thornwall binding vows, in a voice that did not perform the emotion but contained it, and she said them back. When the marking came, she did not flinch. She marked him in return. Old tradition said only the Alpha marked. Old tradition had not been developed with Ashvale bloodline wolves in mind, and she was discovering that she had a wolf with strong opinions about tradition, which was entirely consistent with a consciousness that had spent 20 years in a locked room. The hall erupted. The howls were not the howls of a pack performing acknowledgement, but the sound of a pack that had been waiting for this, that had felt its alpha running at a deficit for years without the language to name what was missing. The sound filled the stone and the timber and vibrated in the old glass of the skylight and came back down. Finn began to cry, then to laugh, in the way of infants overwhelmed by volume and not yet able to sort the feelings out. Renna bounced him with the ease of profound experience and did not stop watching the front of the hall. Nyla stood beside Dre and looked out at the pack, her pack, and felt in the long empty place in her chest, the place that had been hollowed out by a sigil carved in old magic when she was 2 years old and filled in slowly, imperfectly, by pure stubbornness, felt it finely, plainly, full. Later, after the hall had emptied, and the fires had settled and the snow had begun again outside the tall windows, she sat on the floor of their quarters with Finn in her lap. He was working on a wooden ring that one of the senior patrol wolves had left on the bassinet, with no note, which was the kind of gift that told her something precise about the culture of the pack she had walked into. Ray sat across from her, his back against the foot of the bed, long legs stretched out, the formal wear exchanged for ordinary clothes, the marking bite at his neck still dark against his skin. Aldrich asked about Finn, he said, in his last communication. What did you tell him? That the pup is being raised by a woman who crossed a bog in the dark to save him, and that he has opinions about everything and excellent grip strength. She looked at Finn's small hands around the wooden ring. He had been practicing throwing it for 3 days. His aim was enthusiastic if not yet accurate. He wants to meet him eventually, Dre said. When he's ready. He should, she said. When he is. Finn chose this moment to throw the ring. It connected squarely with Dre's collarbone. The Alpha of Thornwall looked down at it, looked at the infant, and handed it back without comment. Good arm, he said. Finn grabbed it with both hands, satisfied. She laughed. It came out easier than it used to, less rust in it, more of whatever laughter is when it has been practiced for a few weeks and remembered its own shape. Dre turned at the sound, and she saw his face do the thing it did when she laughed, the thing she was collecting the same way you collect evidence of something you want to be certain is real. Outside, the moon was past its peak and moving toward the horizon, trailing its light across the snow on the hillside below. A crescent mark on her shoulder caught the edge of that light and held it for a moment, silver and steady, like the first sound of something that had been silent for a very long time finally speaking.